We are live for I'm back in business after a 1 week hiatus. Myself, Ben Raza, here with the man himself, Alex Osmo Baker, and we are going to talk some Thursday night football. That's the good news. The bad news is we have the Redskins and the Vikings here with the man but himself. We'll do it nonetheless. What's going on, my man?
Not much. This game, we've been getting the wackest games. I'm just going to say it in Showdown, but there's still a ton of money to win tonight, and I don't mind that.
Yeah, and you have to we're going to get this right off the top. You have to play a Redskin. Those are the rules. So we will have to talk about both teams. We're going to get into it all, but I do want to say right off the top, our sponsor, Fantasydraft, doing great things over there. The only place where you can play rake-free daily fantasy, 100% of the entry fees. They are running another big tournament, $350,000 Hooters guarantee over there. So if you haven't played and you haven't signed up, go and do that. Awesome-O is the promo code. You get a 1-week free trial. And like I said, the entire pool is going to the entry fees. No rake. It is huge. Makes a big difference. The other thing I want to talk about, we were talking right before the show. We just got word we're running a giveaway today for Thursday Night Football. So all you got to do, go to the Awesome-O Twitter account, retweet, like, and reply with the player who scores the most fantasy points on tonight's game between, sadly, the Redskins and the Vikings. When you do that, you're entered to win an Awesome-O Plus season pass, $250 value. It's a free roll, so just go and do it. Why not?
That's a good point. I think I was looking at my lifetime results, and my ROI, strangely enough, was highest in $0 tournaments.
Can confirm. Look at that. Yep, that's the way to do it. Straight free roll style, but definitely go check those things out. Honestly, it does make a big difference. But we are here to talk. I get it right off the top. The Vikings are a 17-point favorite at home with a total of 42 points in this game. So that just means the Redskins not expected to hang in. They've only got one win, and it was against the Dolphins. That kind of doesn't even count. So it's just a really bad situation.
Yeah, I don't even understand it. I mean, they still got Case Keenum at the head. I mean, they're not on to their third string quarterback, so I'm surprised to see this 13-point team total for them.
Boy, it's the only thing we could talk about is there's revenge narrative all over the place. This Redskins team, all their players are former Vikings apparently. But man, so I guess before, we're of course going to dive in. I guess we'll get injuries right off the top. So Adam Thielen is not going to play. That's going to open up some value at wide receiver for the Vikings, and we'll talk about that. On the other side, Chris Thompson is not going to play, but it looks like Adrian Peterson is, from what I've seen.
That's good news, man, because that has to be one of the top revenge games of the night, right?
AP going back to Minnesota. Now, he's clearly banged up, but they are running out of bodies. The tight end situation as well for the Redskins. We know Jordan Reed is not playing. Looks like Vernon Davis also may be out, so Jeremy Sprinkle would be the next man. We're going to dive into that. Is there anything else that you've seen on the injury front?
Yeah, Vernon Davis and Adam Thielen, the key injuries tonight, I think.
I think so. So last thing before we dive in, I just want to say, I guess in general, because you just talked about it and you weren't lying, we've seen some ridiculous games so far in terms of massive spread, lopsided. Do you approach it any differently when you see a Vikings team that's over a 2-touchdown favorite, or do you still kind of build, I know we're talking narratives, but do you change anything when you see a spread that big?
I think you got to kind of incorporate it into your process here because, I mean, the common train of thought is that Minnesota is going to really dominate this game, but we know in football it's not that predictable. Washington could easily go out and win this game. Let me pull up the money line here. It looks like it's minus 1,100 for Minnesota, plus 650 for Washington. So that means there's around a 1 in 8 chance that the Redskins will actually go out there and win tonight.
Ooh, my God. I mean, the Bills, I will say, it's different teams. The Bills went into Minnesota last year as a massive dog and won a game handily. So you are right. It is the NFL. Crazy things happen. And then from a showdown perspective, the Redskins can be dominated and they could still have more than one guy on the optimal. That is clearly in play. I know everyone I think on a macro level is going to be saying, oh, I'll take 5 Vikings and I'll take 1 Redskin. We want to be careful with that. We're going to dive into it, and I guess we'll start with the home team. It's easier to talk about them first. So, we got a ton of options. Dalvin Cook, most expensive guy on both FanDuel and DraftKings. I mean, I guess we could kick it off right with him. It's hard not to like him, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the stud of the game here, especially with Thielen out. I mean, Minnesota has been running the ball just an absurd amount this year. I have them projected to run almost half the time tonight. Even, I guess, like a couple of weeks ago, there was kind of a narrative that they're going to feed the receivers a little bit more, and then it actually came to fruition with Diggs and Thielen getting some big games. And I mean, they're favored by so much here that you gotta expect Dalvin Cook will now be the mouth they're gonna feed.
He's going to be massively popular, as he should be. I think it's pretty safe to say most popular guy on the slate and probably most popular captain. Now, you've talked a lot about, and I think this is a really underutilized concept in Showdown, when you're playing the two sites. On a site like FanDuel, running back captain, I think makes a little more sense traditionally, whereas on DraftKings with some of the bonuses and some of the, the full point PPR, some receivers kind of get a boost. I still would, you can tell me, I still think you have to have some interest in Dalvin Cook as captain on both sites tonight.
Yeah, one thing I do is I calculate the chance that each player will be the top scorer of the game. And this number for Dalvin Cook is off the charts. It's the highest I've seen all season for a Showdown slate. Almost a 50% chance that Dalvin Cook is your top scorer tonight.
Yeah, so that tells you what you need to know. It's hard to ignore because, as you said, the game flow, he can catch the ball. They are, they don't mind feeding him a ton. And even though a guy like Madison behind him has shown some promise, he's going to get his in a game like this. I think there's no doubt. But we have to look elsewhere. Of course, he's the most expensive guy. So when we're talking a site like DraftKings, he's almost 20,000 in the captain slot. And you plug that in, you're going to have to work with some value elsewhere. We do have Kirk Cousins in his receivers minus Thielen, and they have opened it up a bit. Do you have some interest in this passing game? I mean, I know the Vikings kind of across the border in better matchups, but what do you make of Cousins and the passing attack?
Yeah, I think, with Cook being almost a 50% chance to be the top scorer, that means that 50% of the time he won't be. And in those times, maybe Minnesota has to pass the ball more than anticipated. And then you get guys like Diggs, like Cousins being potential captains, and maybe even a possibility that BC Johnson will step in and catch a couple long balls for touchdowns, and then you could win yourself that $250K outright.
So that is a guy that, I think we're going to have to take notice of tonight. Of course, he's going to garner some ownership. He is really the guy who seems to be slotting into Thielen in terms of the guy who will be with Diggs. He's a rookie out of Colorado State. I'd be lying if I knew a ton about him, but it does seem that he has, I don't want to say jump Laquan Treadwell, but in 2 wide receiver sets, I expect to see Diggs and I expect to see BZ Johnson. So take that for what it's worth. And I think we have seen, especially with Diggs, yeah, it's somewhat erratic, but we know the upside he has. I mean, he could blow the captain spot out of the water on any slate. This is a guy who just had 3 TDs the other day with a number of drops, which I'm not going to go on a rant about him dropping the ball, but should be catching it. And Cousins has been good. So do you think with Dalvin Cook so polarizing, you can kind of leverage against him maybe with a Viking stack through the air?
Yeah, definitely. I think that one potential build you could go for is you load up on the running backs from Washington. I mean, they clearly are leaning towards running the ball, especially after last week where they ran almost 30 times. So if you stack up Wendell Smallwood and Adrian Peterson, then you have Cousins, Diggs, and Johnson. That's a perfectly correlated lineup right there.
It makes sense. And again, in a game like this, you always have to be cognizant in Showdown that you're not just doing what everyone else is, but when there is an obvious narrative out there, and there is when you have a 17-point favorite, it's even more important to say, okay, how can I kind of make a stand while still maybe attacking the Vikings? Similar to that, I've thought about this strategy, and I guess I'll just ask you because you are the perfect person to ask. When you have a guy like Dalvin Cook, do you think you can sometimes get leverage by just playing him in a flex position and not as your captain per se?
That's a great question. I think I'm not really sure tonight if
Hmm.
I would do it because we have Dalvin Cook projected to be 54% owned in the flex on Draftkings, 53% on Fanduel. But because he has such a high chance of being the top scorer, his chance of being either of the next 4 or 5 highest scorers, depending on the site, is lower than his ownership. I mean, the salary cap requires some consideration here, but as far as a flex player, Dalvin Cook is probably one of the worst plays per dollar because he has such a high chance of being the top scorer.
And I think that's the distinction. So this is a concept that I've thought about, and I definitely think there are spots to utilize it. But to me, I'm in 100% agreement. I don't know if this is the one because you just talked about it. The path for Dalvin Cook to be useful yet not be the captain, I think, is pretty low. I feel like if he's not your captain outright, there's a much bigger chance where he busts and you actually don't want him on your team. It kind of seems a little weird for him to be a useful flex unless someone really explodes or there's a weird type of build, which it's possible, but it seems difficult. Uh, I guess we can. I mean, we have to talk. Do you have any interest in these tight ends, whether it be Kyle Rudolph or Irv Smith Jr. for the Vikings? Not really utilized too much.
Yeah, actually, I think that they might be better plays than normal tonight because last week when Thielen went down to injury, what I would have expected to happen is BC Johnson come in as a second wide receiver, and then in 3 wide receiver sets, I would expect Laquan Treadwell. But what actually happened is they ran 2 tight end sets more than 3 wide receiver sets. So you had Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph on the field running routes at the same time on at least 6 plays. Laquan Treadwell only ran 5 routes total. So I think that if I'm going to a third receiver, I would probably go to Rudolph or Irv Smith over Laquan.
Yeah, and Irv Smith is another guy. He's a young guy we haven't seen. He's at Alabama, and they have so many weapons. In college, we really don't know what these guys are, and he's shown some flashes, as you just talked about. Him and Rudolph had an uptick in targets last week, and I think that's definitely because Thielen went down. So maybe looking to some of them as a way to get some not sneaky but different Vikings exposure. That does seem important on a slate like this. And then I mean, we do have to talk about it because they are 17-point favorite, and we really need to kind of look at all Vikings. What do you make of the guys behind Dalvin Cook? In a blowout, maybe they get some more run, or are you saying, you know what, I'm not going to try to chance it, even though on a Thursday night, maybe they do give some extra carries to those backup running backs?
Yeah, I mean, my heart is telling me CJ Ham. He's the fullback for the Vikings, and he's one of the best fullbacks in the league. So I've been projected for 2 fantasy points tonight.
Fire.
But to be honest, I think that Madison, Abdullah, I mean, they could be reasonable plays. I expect Madison to probably be overowned, but in a Vikings blowout, which is pretty likely, there's a good chance he runs the ball more than average. I think a lot of the extra rushing attempts would flow to Madison. Abdullah, someone who sees the field a little bit, but he doesn't have his clear role on the team.
Yeah, the thing with Madison, and I agree, he should see some more uptick in carries. He hasn't. I mean, he has 1 catch. He hasn't caught the ball at all, and I'm not sure there's many scenarios where he needs to do that because Dalvin Cook is do everything at this point, and then you have Abdullah who's kind of just lurking around. So I do agree they'll probably be overowned relative to their likelihood of success. I would rather take a stab more on the outside. If I'm going to change it up, I'm going to look to a Vikings pass catcher as maybe an against the grain type player. But, when you're, again, I know I keep saying it, when you're 17-point favorite, points are coming from somewhere. It's just about how much leverage and how much exposure to this Vikings team.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. I think that maybe if all these Vikings are expected to do so well, then maybe going to some more Redskins might be the play.
I think so. And I mean, anything else, we'll save everyone's favorite, in which apparently you need to talk about its defense these days. We'll save that. Anything else before we move on to the Washington side of the ball?
Let's see. I think this one's pretty simple. You got Cook, probably that's your number one guy, and then if you want to build a lineup with with Cousins, I'd probably pick a couple of receivers and have more Redskins than average in that lineup.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make too, because if the Vikings are forced to really have a big game through the air, you have to imagine they are pushed in some capacity by the Redskins. I don't know how Kirk Cousins could throw for 3 or 4 touchdowns in a full-on. I mean, that seems pretty narrow. So you definitely want to maybe open it up to some Redskins. And, well, they scored 0 points last week. In their defense, it was, I don't know if you saw any of that game, it was an absolute monsoon against the 49ers. So much rain.
Oh man, is that why they ran the ball like a zillion times?
That's the excuse that I'm taking. You know, they lost 9-0, and it was sloppy. Case Keenum, another former Viking, looks like he has the starting job for now. And, you know, he's okay. I think he's better than Haskins, but at the same time, this is a tough spot for any team going against the Vikings defense that's been much better at home and is a pretty balanced, tough unit to attack.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to imagine the Redskins having an easy path to victory here, and I mean that's mostly on the defensive end compared to the offense, where Minnesota isn't as formidable. So I think that's why it's such an interesting showdown slate, is because, I mean, with Minnesota being a good defensive team, like figuring out the right offensive players to pick in this game is tough.
It's super tough, and I think that's the key. You know, to me in these blowout type games, I think the team that is getting the points, the massive underdog, is by far the most important part of the showdown slate. You know, the Vikings, they have pretty obvious big weapons that for the most part are going to play very well. The Redskins, somebody is going to have to step up if they're going to have any success. And the main, I guess, targets to look at. So we mentioned Adrian Peterson. He's banged up. Apparently he has 2 sprained ankles. That doesn't sound good. Another former Viking. But you have to imagine he's at least going to get opportunities on the ground. He had 20 carries last week in the rain, no targets. Do you like him in this spot?
Yeah, I mean, the 2 sprained ankles thing sounds pretty, that makes me pretty nervous about it, but if you just go off of the kind of workload he's getting over the past few weeks, he's probably the number 1 guy on the Redskins, even over Terry McLaurin, because they've been running the ball so much. And part of that is because of the coaching change. They fired the coach. The new coach came in. It's like, we're going to run the ball a zillion times. And, I mean, revenge as well.
In fact, revenge enough. It's tough. So you mentioned, there's a lot of things to break down here. You mentioned McLaurin, who he's a guy I'm throwing last week out for the passing attack. I don't worry about that, but I will say that he is running very pure with touchdowns. He's already got 5. Making the most, and that's going to regress. And this is a very tough spot. You know, he's probably going to draw some roads in terms of coverage, and just, I think I feel more comfortable. At least with these running backs that the volume is secure and they are going to get the ball, just because you can force feed it to them. So I'd rather take a shot there. We do have Wendell Smallwood creeping into relevance here. What do you make for him as a change of pace pass catcher?
Oh man, he's so incredibly cheap on
really
both Draftkings and Fanduel. It's gonna be hard to get away from him, man, because it's like he's 1,800 on Draftkings, 5K on Fanduel, and I mean, with Chris Thompson out, he is the pass catching back. They're gonna have, if they're playing from behind, that means Wendell Smallwood is gonna be on the field a decent amount, and you gotta love that at that price point.
It's hard to ignore. You know, you can match him up with AP. You can do a lot of things. He's a very creative type of guy that fits all different types of builds. And you mentioned, on DraftKings, it's even easier in the sense he could catch 5-6 cheap targets and really pay off that salary, even if the Redskins do absolutely nothing. Because there's a real question of how much can Keenum push it down the field to a guy like McLaurin. Maybe they go underneath to a guy like Smallwood. So I totally see that, but on full slates, I think we mostly get away from these. I don't want to call them bozos, but the Redskins wide receivers outside of McLaurin are so difficult with Paul Richardson, with Trey Quinn. But these are guys I think you do have to look to in a game like this.
Yeah, I mean, I love Trey Quinn and Paul Richardson especially because, man, their game logs are brutal.
Yes.
Paul Richardson, 1 target, 0 receptions last week. 4 targets, 0 receptions in week 6. I mean, the one thing going against him is that he has that name recognition from his days in Seattle where he's actually decent. So I think that people who aren't paying as much attention may just click the name and his ownership might be higher than you expect. So that might lead me to Trey Quinn because Trey Quinn, his game log is almost as bad. 5 points last week, 2.8, 3.8, 3 in the last 4 weeks. So I think most people will be pretty hesitant to click that button.
I agree, and if McLaurin is shut down, the targets have to go somewhere. So these guys should get looks. Now, you just talked about it hasn't materialized. Somehow they can get a handful of targets and come up with 0 catches. That is in play once again, but I think you do have to consider these guys as maybe one of those puzzle pieces. Now, it goes without saying, if for some reason you want to play Keenum, I think you have to look to multiple guys because for him to succeed, these are guys that are going to have to step up against this Vikings defense.
Yeah, man, I have the perfect guy to sprinkle into some lineups.
I see what you did there. Here it is. Like I was telling you before the show, your Twitter game is on fire. These are the type of things why the masses are tuning in. Talk to me about Jeremy Sprinkle in this tight end situation.
I mean, he's just on the field a ton. That's what I'm looking at. So
Yep.
Last week, Vernon Davis was out. Jeremy Sprinkle ran routes on 15 of 16. 16 is absurdly low, but 15 routes on 16 passing plays. So he's being backed up, it appears, by Hale Hentges, who could be a sneaky play as well. Hale Hentges was on the field for 20 of 45 plays, but he only ran 1 route compared to 15 for Sprinkle. So he'd be kind of a deep throw.
That is a person that I did not know exist. I'm just looking at his little blurb, and it said they brought him to the roster and they cut Casanovia McKenzie. That is quite a name.
What? They cut Casanovia McKenzie for Hale Hentges?
No respect, these teams. But again, it's crazy to say this, but volume, especially for a team like this, is somewhat king. Like if you're on the field a handful of plays and if you're running some routes, it can happen. We see it with Showdown all the time, and the Redskins, I know it feels like they're going to get shut out, but most likely they are not. I hate to be a downer on just every defense shuts the bad team out like we saw with my Jets, but it doesn't always work like that. So you may have to look to these type of guys. I guess we'll kind of just circle back just a bit, and I don't want to dive in. We're going to talk to captain specifically, but I just want to ask you, do you have massive interest in the Redskins at any captain spots tonight?
You gotta really consider these Redskins a captain. I mean, because as we talked about, there's about a 12% chance they're gonna win the game. The chance that one of these guys will have the highest score in the game, just adding these up real quick, is about 20 to 25%, maybe a little bit more than 25%. So I think that if people are really laying off the Redskins, that makes them pretty appealing.
I think you do have to consider it. And again, part of Showdown is trying to identify what is everybody else thinking. And tonight is easy. Everybody's thinking the same thing. The Vikings defense, the Vikings offense, the Vikings everything. So being different with a Redskin, as you said, most likely they probably played really bad, but there are many, many outcomes where they hang in the game, and there are certainly some outcomes where they actually have a chance to win this game. We'll move to kickers and defense. I do want to say real quick, one other thing that was brought to my attention before the show. We have a couple things actually free in front of the paywall today. Do you want to talk to people about the Showdown rankings, which are free for everyone today?
Yeah, absolutely. Our Showdown rankings are part of the Express package, which is, I believe, $3.95 a week. So it's kind of a low price point for you to get into the fantasy game, get some advice, because I know a lot of these sites, they charge $40-50 a month or more, and if you're only entering a few lineups, that might be a little bit too much to invest. So what I do with my rankings is I'll give evaluations based on my projections of a guy's overall chance to put up fantasy points, and also the value you're getting on your dollar for the salary cap. So for example, we got Dan Bailey here as a C in total points projected, but he's an A in value because he's 4K, and that could be a really nice piece to a winning lineup tonight.
Absolutely. And it's a perfect segue to Dan Bailey's part of the show, which is kickers and defense. So I guess we'll talk, this is what I'll pass it to you, but this is what I would think. Obviously, Minnesota's kicker should have plenty more opportunities for extra points and field goals than the Redskins. What do you make of the two kickers in this one?
Yeah, I concur with that assessment for sure. I mean, like, the Redskins, if you think they're going to get a lot of field goals, you can make a lot of money betting some sports books tonight, because I think they're projected for about 1 field goal and 1 touchdown. So, I mean, that only equals like 5 points.
Yeah. And that might be, like I said, that almost feels like a ceiling from Hopkins in this spot. So I'm with you. I think Dan Bailey makes a very reasonable play. Someone that I consider, not that you can't play them together, of course you can, but I think if you're maybe trying to be sneaky and fade Dalvin Cook, you hope they stall in the red zone. Running backs tend to need touchdowns more, especially on non-full PPR sites. So maybe you think they stall and Dan Bailey really picks up some of Dalvin's points, and that's one way to leverage against a massively popular Dalvin Cook.
That's a good point. I mean, if the Vikings didn't score a touchdown tonight, there's a pretty good chance that Dan Bailey might be the highest scorer, and I don't think many people will have him at the MVP.
That is so do you, I mean, that is normally a really atypical build. Would you consider running a kicker at a captain type spot?
I would consider it. I mean, I've done it. I'll do it in 1 to 2 lineups a week probably. Mm-hmm. They actually took down the big prizes a week or 2 ago. I can't remember exactly what game, but I was pretty tilted because the kicker and captain won like 100K. So it definitely can get there. What you need to happen if you're going to put a kicker in the captain usually is that a lot of the highest salary guys do well, and you need them all in your lineup, which is only possible with a value captain.
That's true. Especially, certainly on DraftKings, which is what we're talking about here, the ability to save the salary, because as much as Dalvin Cook should smash tonight, again, he's almost 20,000, and when you do that, you just actually are unable to play other combinations of 2 guys. Like, you just can't do it, basically. When you punt captain, there are ways where even though the captain isn't what wins it, it allows you to take 5 guys that are just a combination you can't get without them. So that is something to consider, and one of the reasons you at least have to look to a guy like Dan Bailey. Now, I would expect, especially I think with recency bias, not with the Vikings, but with Showdown in general, for the Vikings defense to be massively popular.
Yeah. I think, man, we saw the Patriots defense was like 20% owned at captain.
It's insane.
Against the Jets. So, I mean, we know, being fantasy football vets, that defenses usually don't excel. And I think this is a great spot where the Vikings defense could easily bust, because Case Keenum doesn't throw many picks. He's at about 2.5%, which is about average. And in addition, they're not passing the ball that much. So that makes it hard to get sacks because they don't have a quarterback that runs the ball. And when you don't get sacks and you don't get picks, that makes it hard to win with the defense.
Certainly. I mean, we have seen a ridiculous run. And again, I've preached on this show that this is where you don't want to just blindly separate what happens from your process, but it's important to realize that sometimes these teams are over-owned. And just because they get there, it doesn't mean that if you ran it thousands of times, it would be the optimal move. And I think the Patriots paid off. Everyone that did that got paid off. Everyone that didn't lost. That makes it even harder to fade the Vikings tonight. But for me, I'm going to embrace, certainly I'll have some exposure to them, but I think you have to consider that they don't just destroy the slate like we've been seeing.
I hope you're right, man, because I might lose some money if we're not. I mean, it is kind of appealing to get 22 guys at the captain spot. You get the defense, and you also get the special teams. I forgot to mention that this morning, but
there you go.
Maybe punt return touchdowns or something.
That's what spoke me about. I mean, I'm not going to go on another rant about the Patriots, but like even when the Patriots defense wasn't doing it, they're blocking punts, they're scoring in crazy ways. It's of course it can work. It's just again, you are trying to balance likelihood of success against ownership at both the captain and the flex. And I do think that right now we're seeing defense inflated. Now, you want to get radical. Do you have any interest in going totally against the grain with the Redskins defense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Vikings are not like brilliant offensive team. I'm gonna be a little biased because I went to the Chicago Bears versus Vikings game where
yeah, that was ugly.
Yeah, the Vikings just couldn't get anything going. I mean, the Redskins aren't as good a defense certainly, but maybe they could play like one night of the season. So I think that I might sprinkle in some Redskins D. I think based on the narratives we're talking about, the Vikings D. This might be a rare situation where I just completely X them out of my player pool because this is like they're not that cheap, and I feel like the ownership, as we're discussing, is going to be bolstered by the fact that people have been winning so much money rostering defense.
I love it. I mean, that is right in my wheelhouse. Now, truth be told, I did that with the Jets game, and I got absolutely shellacked. But you know what? That happens, and you can't let it deter you in the sense of that should not affect your process. If you want to play the Vikings tonight, of course, I understand that, but you don't want to say, oh, I got killed with that Patriots defense. I don't want to do that again. That is unrelated. And yes, chat, I appreciate it. Matt Prater was the kicker with the Lions, and he was, someone is sitting on a pile of cash because of that guy. So it can happen. But I'm with you. I think the Redskins defense, of course, is going to be minuscule owned, and crazy things happen, fluke things. And we are talking, I know Kirk Cousins is on a high right now, but this is a guy that we've seen time and time again make some mistakes. You couldn't have a better situation, I admit that. But at the same time, he's not above a couple turnovers in a game, and that can really be a difference maker when we're talking defense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, talking some game flows here, a game flow that might be sneaky likely to happen is that the Redskins have a couple of fluky plays where maybe they get a defensive touchdown, a sack or two, and a fumble, and then they just run clock out the whole second half, and that's what they like to do, is just run the ball. So in that kind of scenario, you could easily see a defense win it for you.
Yeah, I mean, the Redskins, you would have to think. I'm not saying this is going to work, but in their mind, ideally, it's control the clock, shorten this game, try to force a couple turnovers. If they have Keenum dropping back 50 times in this game, well, I think we know that is going to end horribly for them. So it's something to consider. It's going to be a different type of build than in a game like this. I mean, we know in Showdown, you can play the Redskins defense with certainly plenty of Vikings in there and hope for that lucky TD, and then the Vikings kind of have to claw back, which they're more than capable of doing. Before we get out, we're going to talk a couple other things. I just do want to say, Chad, appreciate you, in the middle of the day hanging out with us. If you can hit the like button, it helps keep this show free and all the stuff that we have over on awesemo.com in front of the paywall. We have so much behind it, but we do like doing these shows for you. So if you can press that like button and subscribe to the channel, it means a ton. But looking at the ownership, I mean, we've mentioned Dalvin Cook, we've mentioned the Vikings defense. Is there anyone on the Redskins in particular that you think maybe is a little over-owned? Is it Paul Richardson, as you mentioned earlier?
Ooh, well, let me bring up our ownership projections real quick. I think that Wendell Smallwood could become over-owned because he is so cheap, and he's kind of like the natural play. But he does also make a lot of sense as far as salary cap. So if I had to pick one guy that has a lot of potential to be overowned, I might say Smallwood. Who do you think?
For me, it would be McLaurin. I think that he is I get it. He is the weapon on the outside, But I think people look and they see the touchdowns and they see the big games and they may say, oh, I need one Redskin. Let me go to him. And I get that. I totally do. I just think there are so many other weapons that are cheaper for me that I'm willing to say, you know what, they're going to get a lot of work too. And maybe, if the Vikings prioritize McLaurin, it could be tough sledding for him. So I probably stay away and take more shots with the Trey Quinns of the world and hope I can get something with the mid-range Redskins, as gross as that feels.
I like it, man. I think that everyone probably wants McLaurin if they're going Redskins wide receivers, but Paul Richardson and Trey Quinn, they could easily have a bigger game.
It's definitely possible, like I said, and with the ownership discount that you should see from them to a guy like McLaurin, I think it's worthwhile. So before we get out of here, I do want to just ask, so, I think our favorite captain, can we say Dalvin Cook? Is there somebody else besides him, I guess, that you think you'll have some captain teams of?
Man, I mean, Dalvin Cook is so likely to be the best player, but the ownership is also extremely high at captain, at least as we project. Now our ownership projections don't take into account some factors, like I think that the defense has been on a hot streak. That kind of macro factor may not be incorporated into the ownership. But actually, now I'm looking at it, Dalvin Cook's captain ownership is much lower than his chance of being the best scorer. So I think that that makes a lot of sense. And the one build that could work especially well is if you pick Cook at captain, and then you leave some money on the table, and then you might have a really unique combination with a great chance to win.
And I do think that's something that's interesting because I think what happens with most people, if you take a really expensive captain, you tend to use more of your salary because you're like, oh man, I'm really strained. I got to pay up as much as I can. So if you have the ability to use Cook and still leave some money on the table, that's going to be pretty different. I think most people are uncomfortable when they have to really jam some of those guys. But as we just talked about, especially on the Redskins side, there are cheap options. And yes, they're not great players, but if the Redskins score 17, 20 points in this game, somebody outside of the main weapons are going to have to contribute. So I think you can get away with something like Dalvin Cook and some of those lesser known names.
I like it. Yeah, I think that it's also like interesting because if you spend down at captain, then there's a tendency to go for all the most expensive guys too. So it's like you're trying to like balance everything. Like there are much fewer combinations of good players with a cheap captain than there are with a chalky captain like Cook, and that allows you to gain some differentiation by using some of the strategies we're talking about here.
Certainly. I mean, just to kind of say that again, when you punt at captain, you're like, oh, I got all this money. Let me click Dalvin Cook. Let me pick Diggs. Let me click McLaurin. A lot of other people who pay down. So it's about, if you get that captain right, you still want to make sure that you have a path to victory. And that is really important. So change it up. Try to be unique. And to me, my final thoughts before we bounce on out of here, I think the guy, not that he's the key to the slate, but I think seeing what happens outside of Diggs in the sense of BZ Johnson or the Vikings tight ends is really the underrated aspect of this slate. If they go and they pepper targets to BZ Johnson, he's going to be really important. But I think there's a very real chance that Irv Smith or Kyle Rudolph actually get the boost. And that could be one of the main ways to really have a good night tonight.
I like it, man. I think that's a pretty good way to win this 250K because Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph, their ownership's a lot lower than some of the other guys.
I think so. I think most people naturally think, oh, wide receiver's out. Let me find the wide receiver that replaces them. Yeah, of course that's true, from a positional standpoint, but it doesn't mean production-wise that it just falls to the next man up for a wide receiver. So keep that in mind. Any final thoughts that you want to tell the people before we bounce on out of here for this Redskins-Vikings clash?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's going to be a great game as we've been breaking it down for you guys. Thanks so much for tuning in despite the fact that it's Redskins, Minnesota. My final thought here is that just avoid playing too fancy. And what I mean by that is trying to go for backup quarterbacks, some real like dart throws like maybe a Amir Abdullah or even to a lesser extent Alexander Madison, guys that And maybe there's a path to victory, but these guys all tend to be overowned as everyone's trying to figure out like the cute combination to win it outright. So the better strategy, in my opinion, is just kind of ignoring some of the plays that are less likely to go off and maybe coming up with some interesting combinations of players.
Well said. I think one of the fatal aspects of Showdown is people say, well, it's one game, I got to do something crazy. Yes, you want to be different, but taking guys that have barely any path to victory and hoping that you hit lightning it's not going to work long term. Of course, when Mahomes went down, everyone wishes they had Matt Moore combos, but realistically, that's just not what you want to do. So I think that's well said. There are ways to get guys on the field just in different combinations and different aspects. So I want to say once again, chat, appreciate it. Hit the like button and make sure you do the giveaway. It's free. It's worth a shot on Twitter, and you can win a full season pass of our NFL package, which is awesome. We have a lot of things coming out and so many good tools behind the paywall. So, Alex, my man, thanks for taking the time to talk this one with me. This was bad. I'm not going to lie. 17 points is a tough one, but we have better games ahead. So we're going to get on out of here. Good luck, everyone. If you have any questions, find us on Twitter, and we hope to see you in Slack soon enough. And we'll be back here next week with another Thursday Night Showdown.